Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're taking a look at the Rolex Datejust II /41. We're going to look at both these models as they're relatively similar. Okay, so as with all my reviews, let's go back in time now and look at the history of this watch. We're going to go back to the 1940s, specifically 1945, which marked the 40th anniversary for Rolex. And to celebrate this 40th anniversary, they wanted to release a new model, and they decided to release the Datejust. The Datejust was a pretty special model in the fact that it was a much easier way of using a timepiece with a date function. Previous to that, so the previous models like the Oyster Perpetual models previous to the Datejust featured the date function. When you had to change the date, you had to cycle through the hours of the day. So you'd have to cycle for a full 24 hours. Rather than being able to adjust just your date on its own like we can on modern day watches now. So it was quite a cumbersome thing, and I'm sure people that own a watch that has this function where you've got to cycle through the hours of the day in order to change your date, you know the struggle, and especially if you miss that day or you go one past, then you've got to then do a full month's worth of winding, which takes a long time. So this was a really welcomed feature for clients and for Rolex when they created the Datejust function. So basically the Datejust was named the Datejust because it had a position on the crown when you pulled out the crown where you could just adjust in the movement just the date on its own, which made it obviously much more easier to adjust the date than having to cycle through the different hours of the day. And that kind of became Rolex's first big famous model, and has remained actually since the 40s till now one of the most important watches in the watch industry, and probably the most recognizable Rolex along with the Submariner. It's just an iconic timepiece. The fluted bezel, the Jubilee bracelet is just the pure essence of Rolex for me. Okay, so there was lots and lots of models over the years for the Datejust, precious metals, steel, combinations, so two-tone watches with yellow and steel. Lots of different variations, including precious dials, so dials made from precious gems or precious stones. There's tons and tons of variations of the Datejust. Probably one of the biggest variations of all Swiss watches in the industry. There are just so many different combinations of dials, bezels, diamonds, bracelets, clasps. The Datejust is one of the most customizable watches you can buy from a luxury Swiss watch brand, if that makes sense. So tons and tons of models over the years, but the ones that we are interested in are the Datejust II, which was released in 2009. So this one that we're looking at today is actually a Datejust II, but this model is quite unique in the fact that it is still in the current collection for Rolex. It's just with the slightly updated case that the Datejust 41 has. So we're going to talk about both the Datejust II and the Datejust 41 in this video, because essentially this watch is it is a 41, but it's just featuring the old Datejust II case. So previous to 2009, when the Datejust II was released, the biggest Datejust you could buy was the 36mm Datejust. That was kind of the standard men's size for Datejust then. But obviously all the sports models Rolex were creating, like the Daytona, the Submariner, were all featuring bigger case sizes at 40mm. And around 2009, as we discussed last week with the Yachtmaster 2, there was a lot of interest from the pop industry, pop culture, rappers, hip hop, etc., that were after bigger watches and that were wearing bigger watches publicly as well. And that really helped the popularity of timepieces, but definitely created a trend towards bigger timepieces as well. So Rolex recognized this and realized that the 36mm Datejust wasn't going to cut it anymore in this modern society where people prefer bigger watches. So they released the Datejust II in 2009, and that featured a 41mm case size, so much bigger than the 36mm, and definitely defined itself as a large or men's watch at that point. The Datejust II, wasn't around for too long. It actually was discontinued in 2016 and replaced by the Datejust 41. The Datejust 41 was a slightly more refined version of the Datejust II. The Datejust II was also only available in a Oyster bracelet like we're looking at here today. It was never available in the Jubilee bracelet, which was kind of the iconic Datejust look. So that was a really welcome addition to the larger Datejust in the collection. It also was available in rose gold and steel as well, which was a new option which the Datejust II didn't have. It also had much nicer dials in my opinion. I personally don't like the dials from the Datejust 2. I don't like the big chunky batten indexes that the Datejust 2 had. The Datejust 41 overall was a much more refined watch. They updated the movement with a much better movement as well. They updated all the dials, and almost all the dials. In fact, this dial was one of the only dials that actually remained and didn't change, which is why I'm comparing the 41 and the 2 in this one video. So yeah, it was definitely a welcome change to the Datejust collection, the Datejust 41, and definitely increased popularity. The Datejust 2 was popular, but not mega popular. I think after a little while, definitely towards 2013, 2014, it started to dip in popularity, as it just, people tend to not look at such chunky watches like that. The Datejust 41 is slightly slimmer, slightly sleeker, and I think looks more like a scaled up version of the 36mm Datejust, which is really the icon. That's what all Datejusts are built on, the 36. Personally, I much prefer the Datejust 41, but I'll show you some small minor changes that they made between the 41 and the 2. But first, let's take a look at the features of this watch. So we're going to start, as always, with the clasp. The clasp on this watch is an oyster clasp. It's slightly different to the standard oyster clasp we see on most of the Rolexes, with the fold over part of the clasp at the top. We don't have that on the Datejust. We actually just have a one-piece clasp that kind of has this spring at the top of the clasp rather than having that fold over bit. This is obviously, even though it is a sports watch, is not designed to be worn during sporty events like diving or motor racing. So Rolex didn't feel the need to put that extra bit of security with a fold over on this watch. The Datejust, or the Datejust models with the Jubilee bracelet, feature this same clasp as well. They don't feature, the slightly smaller ones like a 36mm feature like a hidden clasp, which is really nice. But the 41s feature this slightly larger clasp. There is an advantage though to that, and that is the fact that this clasp still features the easy link adjustment, which means you can increase the size of the bracelet by 5mm, which really helps out in summer when your wrist expands a little bit in the heat. Simple clasp, I much prefer the oyster clasp though, with the fold over section that we see on all the sports models from Rolex. I think that's a much better clasp than this, but still a great clasp. It's super slim, probably a little bit slimmer than the oyster clasp. So yeah, I mean, it fits the purpose of this watch. It's meant to be a more dressy sports watch. Moving now to the bracelet. On this model, we have the oyster bracelet, which is exactly the same oyster bracelet that you get on the modern Datejust 41. Very simple bracelet, same that we'll see on the Daytona, the GMT Master, and many of the other watches in the Rolex collection. It's pretty standard bracelet from Rolex. This one features polished center links and brushed outer links. Obviously polished center links to match the nice shiny case, the full polished case we have on this watch, and our fluted bezel. It looks really nice. It's very, very comfortable. It's one of the most comfortable bracelets in the industry. Can't fault the oyster bracelet. It's one of my favorites, and I find it one of the most comfortable as well. The Datejust 41 now features, or the option to have, a Jubilee bracelet, which is in keeping with the rest of the collection from Rolex for the Datejusts. The Jubilee you may find slightly more comfortable because it features slightly smaller links, which means it conforms to a shape of a wrist a little bit better than this would do. But nonetheless, I do find this really comfortable, and the Jubilee is also really comfortable as well. A lot of people do prefer the Jubilee bracelet because it matches that fluted bezel and that slightly more dressy tone that this watch has. Some people find this oyster bracelet a bit too casual and sporty for the Datejust. Personally, I prefer the oyster bracelet because I like it to look a little bit more understated anyway. Now moving on to our case. The case between this and the Datejust 41 is almost identical. The only real way to change or tell between a Datejust 41 and a Datejust 2 is actually if you turn the watch to the side and look at the left of the case or the right hand side of the case. You can see that on the 41 it is slightly more of a chunkier case towards the lugs. They kind of swoop down at a much sharper angle, whereas on the Datejust 41 we have a slightly more slim looking case. It's not actually that much slimmer, or I don't think it's actually slimmer at all. But the actual case is slightly more elongated, and those lugs don't swoop down as sharp an angle. They kind of swoop in a more gradual way. Very, very, very subtle. The biggest difference between these watches is the movement, really. Other than that, they are almost identical. The case on this watch is all polished, which obviously suits this style of watch very nicely, the fact it's more of a dressy sports watch. We also have our fluted bezel on this watch, which is stunning. I think maybe, I don't know if it's just me, but the fluted bezels on the Datejust 2s tend to look a little bit wider than they do on the Datejust 41s. Personally, I prefer the Datejust 41, slightly more slimmer bezel. I think it looks nicer and not so big and chunky, but this looks really, really beautiful, especially with this dial. It definitely has more of a refined, more Datejust 41 look about it, rather than the old chunkier dial with the big index Datejust 2. The fluted bezel is kind of the most iconic thing about the Datejust, along with the Jubilee bracelet, but the fluted bezel is really how you straight away know that that's a Datejust. Rolex obviously features that fluted bezel now on the day dates as well, and it is just such a lovely feature. When you see one in real life, it is stunning how just super sparkly and lively it is. It's almost like a diamond in itself. I really, really love the angles that they've created on these fluted bezels. It's definitely something you've got to see in real life to appreciate. It's quite hard to convey how special this looks on video. Next, moving on to our dial. On this dial, we've got a really, really nice dial that's actually still in the current collection for the Datejust 41. And that is a beautiful sunburst effect, grey slate dial with diamond dot markers. I think this is absolutely stunning, this dial. It's one of my favourite dials from Rolex ever on all models. The reason being is it's very understated for a diamond dial. When you catch it in the light and kind of direct sunlight, that dial really comes to life. Those beautiful kind of etching on the dial from the laser to create that sunburst effect really comes to life. And it just has kind of this real warmth to it that is really hard to describe, and it suits obviously the rest of the watch really nicely because it's a grey and the watch is steel and white gold. So it definitely suits the watch really, really nicely, this grey. The diamonds also have that little bit of fire and sparkle. When you get them in the right light, you get a little bit of spectrum of light off those in terms of some different colours that the diamonds will shine off, i.e. their fire. And that adds even more colour depth and special tone to the watch. The watch is very understated still though, even though it is a diamond dial. The dial definitely tones down this piece. You can go for much more blingy dials than this. I think this is actually really, really beautiful. The most blingy thing about this watch really is the fluted bezel. That definitely catches a lot of attention because it is so sparkly. Okay, on to whether or not I would own this watch. I would 100% own this watch. I think it's an absolutely stunning looking piece. I personally prefer the Datejust 41 models much more so than the Datejust 2, but this one here obviously is pretty much identical to the Datejust 41 equivalent, so I can kind of generalize this discussion now to both of them if we're talking about this watch. I would definitely own the Datejust 41, maybe some Datejust 2s, specifically this one. I love this dial with the grey and the diamonds. I'm not a huge fan of sparkly, shiny watches, but this one for me just is really, really special. Yeah, I think it's one of the most underrated Rolexes actually. Definitely worth seeing in real life to really appreciate how special this watch actually is. I personally prefer to go for much smaller watches, more like a 38, 39mm watch, more so 39mm. So this wears probably a little bit, or this is probably a watch that's slightly too big for what I would usually go for. But actually on the wrist, this wears more like a 40mm, I say. It definitely doesn't wear like a 41, you know, a big 41. The watches from Audemars Piguet wear much larger than this. And yeah, this is just a really, really stunning piece. I love the dressy vibe that this one has with the fluted bezel. I would personally go for this oyster bracelet, even though I really appreciate the Jubilee bracelet, and I understand that really has a collection of fans that really appreciate the Datejust for that Jubilee bracelet. So I think that's really what I'm coming to, is the Datejust is a fantastic piece that nowadays is kind of overlooked in the Rolex collection because people tend to look for sports models, because most people are looking for an investment or wanting to make money on their watches. But actually the Datejust models are so brilliant because you can really truly find the most perfect one for you. You know, starting with the dial, you find your perfect, beautiful dial. You can choose whether or not you want a diamond bezel or a fluted bezel or a smooth bezel. You can choose the material, or you know, the metal of your watch. You can choose if you want it two-tone. You can choose the bracelet as well on the watch. You can just choose so many different features on that, or variants of that watch, that you can definitely find your most perfect version. And that's what I really love about Datejusts. I wish they were more popular. I hope they become more popular. We definitely are seeing some interest in Datejust now, especially on models like this one where they're on the steel. they're starting to do better. You know, some of them selling for over their list price. So that's definitely helped the popularity and some interest into these models. Let us know in the comments what you think of this watch. Do you like the Datejust? Do you prefer the Datejust 2 or Datejust 41? Would you prefer maybe a Datejust 36? There's still lots of people that love the 36. Would you wear this on a Jubilee bracelet or the Oyster bracelet? Let us know in the comments what your dream combination would be for this watch. And as always, if you're interested in this model, this exact model, then don't hesitate to contact us, or any other models within the Rolex collection or Swiss watch industry. It'd be a pleasure to call those watches into stock for you.